In the sprawling machinery of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler armed millions to serve his vision of conquest. Yet amid the thundering march of his war machine, there existed a shadow army, men whose very presence in German uniform represented a profound contradiction. These were soldiers Hitler needed, but refused to fully trust with weapons. Berlin, 1942. As German forces bled across two fronts, the Reich faced a desperate manpower shortage. The solution seemed obvious: tap into the vast reservoir of able-bodied men already under Nazi control. But in the paranoid mind of the Führer, some threats loomed larger than battlefield defeats. Some men, he believed, were more dangerous armed than the enemy they might face. They were known as the Ausbataillon, the Eastern Battalions. By 1942, as the tide of war began to turn against Germany, the Wehrmacht began forming combat units from Soviet prisoners of war. Hundreds of thousands of captured Red Army soldiers facing starvation in Nazi camps were given a devil's bargain: fight for the Reich or die in captivity. The contradiction was staggering. These were men from ethnic groups the Nazis had explicitly classified as Untermenschen, subhumans. According to Nazi racial ideology, these Slavic peoples were to be exterminated or enslaved. Yet here they were, being asked to wear German uniforms and defend the Reich. Turkic, Cossack, Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, men from across the Soviet Empire found themselves fighting under the swastika. But Hitler's paranoia created a bizarre battlefield reality. We were ordered to arm them, but cautiously. Some battalions received only one rifle for every 2 men. Others had no ammunition except during actual combat operations. Always, German officers would count the bullets before and after. Any unaccounted for would mean severe punishment for the entire unit. For Hitler, the fear was simple and profound. These were men who had every reason to hate the Reich. Their homelands had been invaded, their families subjected to Nazi occupation, their comrades executed by the thousands in POW camps. If fully armed, what would prevent them from turning their weapons against their German overseers? The Nazi leadership created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By treating these soldiers with such obvious suspicion, limiting their weapons, placing them under constant surveillance, and reminding them of their inferior status, they reinforced every reason these men had to be disloyal. In private war conferences, recorded and preserved by history, Hitler's paranoia about arming non-Germans became a repeated theme. His racial worldview had created a tactical problem. The Reich needed soldiers but could not bring itself to trust those it had conquered. One must never forget that Moscow trained them. The Bolshevik poison runs in their veins. Give them rifles today, and tomorrow those same rifles will be aimed at German hearts. This wasn't merely ideological rigidity. Hitler had historical precedents that fed his fears. During World War I, Germany had armed and trained Finnish troops to fight against Russia. After the war, those same Finnish soldiers used their German training and weapons to secure independence. Hitler was determined not to repeat what he saw as a catastrophic mistake, creating future enemies by arming current allies of convenience. By 1943, as German losses mounted on all fronts, military pragmatists like General Heinz Guderian argued for fully integrating the Eastern battalions into the Wehrmacht. In a heated exchange with Hitler in August 1943, Guderian pointed to successful examples where these units had fought effectively. Hitler's response was telling: "I don't care how well they fight against the Russians. I care what they will do when we are pushed back to the Reich borders. You think they will defend German soil with the same conviction as Germans?" Perhaps no unit better embodied Hitler's contradictory approach to arming questionable soldiers than the infamous 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, better known as the Dirlewanger Brigade. Formed in 1940 and commanded by Oskar Dirlewanger, a convicted criminal and sadist, this unit initially consisted of poachers and forestry offenders before expanding to include convicted criminals, psychiatric patients, and political prisoners from concentration camps. The Dirlewanger Brigade represented a unique experiment. Could the Reich's undesirables be used as an expendable combat force? These were men the Nazi regime had previously locked away, now given uniforms and sent to the most dangerous parts of the Eastern Front. Hitler's approach to arming this disturbing force revealed his fundamental calculation. The brigade was primarily deployed against partisans and civilians in occupied territories, particularly in Belarus and Poland. When fighting regular military forces, they were given limited ammunition and outdated weapons. They were cannon fodder, pure and simple. Dirlewanger's men were sent to the most hopeless positions with the poorest equipment. If they survived, they had served their purpose. If they died, the Reich had rid itself of undesirables. Hitler viewed it as a solution to two problems. During the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, the brigade was unleashed with minimal restrictions, committing some of the worst atrocities of the war. Yet even then, Nazi leadership maintained tight control over their weaponry when not in direct combat. The pattern was clear: these men could be armed when facing Poland's home army or Belarus civilians, but never fully trusted. Their weapons were tools for advancing Nazi brutality, not defending the Reich itself. Perhaps the most striking example of Hitler's contradictory approach to arming ideologically suspect soldiers was the case of the Indian Legion, a unit of Indian prisoners of war who had been captured while fighting for the British. In 1941, Nazi Germany joined with Indian nationalist Subhas Chandra Bose to form a military unit from these Pehbudus, promising them that fighting for Germany would lead to India's independence from British rule. The creation of the Indian Legion was a propaganda coup for Nazi Germany. Here were colonial subjects of Germany's enemy, now wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. But the reality behind the propaganda images was starkly different. Despite elaborate ceremonies and public displays of German-Indian brotherhood, Hitler privately expressed contempt for the Indian soldiers and extreme skepticism about arming non-Aryans. The Emperor instructed us to limit their access to heavy weapons and maintain a ratio of at least one German officer or NCO for every 20 Indian soldiers. Their ammunition was to be strictly controlled and their deployment limited to areas where desertion would be difficult. The Indian Legion spent most of the war in non-combat roles in the Netherlands and France. When finally committed to combat in 1944, many seized the opportunity to desert to Allied forces or French resistance groups. Hitler's suspicion became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By treating these Indian soldiers as inherently untrustworthy and limiting their combat effectiveness through restricted weaponry, the Nazi leadership ensured their commitment to the German cause remained shallow at best. Hitler's paranoia about arming soldiers he distrusted had profound strategic consequences for the Reich. By 1944, with German manpower critically depleted, hundreds of thousands of potential combat troops remained underutilized due to ideological suspicion. We're looking at a significant military opportunity cost. Had these various foreign units been properly equipped, trained, and trusted, they could have made a meaningful difference on the Eastern Front. But Hitler's racial ideology trumped military necessity. Even as the Reich crumbled, the fate of these distrusted soldiers varied. When the Soviet advance accelerated in 1944, many Eastern Battalion soldiers, knowing the brutal treatment that awaited captured traitors, fought with desperate courage despite their limited weaponry. Others seized opportunities to desert or surrender when possible. We lived in a terrible no-man's land. The Germans gave us just enough weapons to fight, but never enough to feel secure. We knew what awaited us if captured by the Soviets, and we knew the Germans would shoot us if we showed any hesitation. Every day was a calculation of survival. In the war's final months, as the Reich collapsed, Hitler's paranoia reached new heights. Orders went out to disarm many foreign units entirely, even as Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. The story of the soldiers Hitler feared to arm illuminates a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Third Reich. A regime built on racial mythology found itself dependent on the very people it had deemed inferior or untrustworthy. Yet even facing annihilation, it could not fully overcome its paranoid ideology. These soldiers represent one of history's bitter ironies. Men who had suffered under Nazi occupation, men the Reich had imprisoned or persecuted, found themselves in German uniforms but never fully accepted. They were asked to die for a cause that viewed them as expendable at best, subhuman at worst. Their legacy remains complex and often forgotten. Soldiers caught between impossible choices, wielding weapons that symbolized both their utility to the Reich and the profound distrust that defined their service. In the end, Hitler's fear of arming these men may have been justified. Many did indeed harbor hatred for the Nazi regime, but in refusing to trust them fully, Hitler created yet another fatal weakness in his war machine, an army within an army, bound by coercion rather than conviction, holding weapons that embodied not strength but suspicion. In the annals of World War II, they remain shadowy figures, the unwanted patriots, the distrusted defenders, the soldiers Hitler feared to arm.